Hi friends, I'm Dave Barnhart, pastor of St. Junia United Methodist Church, and I'm sharing with you some of my favorite biblical contradictions. Today's contradiction comes from the different accounts of the resurrection. Now this is in all four Gospels, it's toward the end of all of them, and if we were to talk about all of the contradictions, this would be a very long video. Whether the women go before or after sunrise, which women and how many go, how many angels there are, whether there are guards present or not, whether Peter and the beloved disciple or just Peter go, and so on and so forth. And as I've shared in the other videos, what I think is really fascinating about these different stories is that the people who compiled the Bible, the people who put the Bible together, didn't really care that there were contradictions, showing that they cared about something other than consistency. The particular contradiction I want to share with you today, though, is where those people are told to go, where Jesus or the angels tell them to go after the resurrection. Here's how it goes in the Gospel of Mark. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Now this makes sense in Mark because in the Gospel of Mark, most of the action happens in Galilee, happens in Capernaum and the area around the Sea of Galilee. And when Jesus comes to Jerusalem and confronts the religious leaders, that's when he gets killed. Now Matthew also agrees with Mark, but in Matthew's version, Jesus shows up and tells them himself. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings," and they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." So Mark and Matthew, Jesus says, go to Galilee. But when you get to the Gospel of Luke, things change suddenly. "And see, I'm sending upon you what my Father promised. So stay here in the city until you have been clothed with power from on high." Now, maybe you're wondering why it matters, who told the disciples or where they were told to go. And if you're reading the Bible strictly for devotional and spiritual reasons, if you're looking for insights about what God is telling you to do with your life, then where Jesus or an angel tells the disciples to go may not be that important. However, I will point out that this is the first instruction that the disciples receive after the resurrection. But the reason that I care is that I believe we're seeing evidence of a tension in the early church, a tension about power and a struggle for control. Last week I talked about an early church conflict over circumcision and a conflict between Peter and Paul. Christians in Antioch and Damascus were generally in favor of including uncircumcised Gentiles in their community, but they had to have a summit in Jerusalem with Peter and James and the other apostles to decide if they were going to be that inclusive. So when Mark writes his gospel to an audience of mostly Gentiles, he's very clear that Jesus wants the church to be in a place that's mostly Gentile, in Syria, up near Galilee, not in Jerusalem. In fact, when Mark talks about the disciples, as you read through the Gospel of Mark, you'll see that generally he talks about them as though they're numbskulls. In Mark's Gospel, the disciples are idiots. They don't understand things. They're always messing up. But by the time Luke writes his Gospel, he's got a different agenda. He wants to make peace between the church that was in Jerusalem and the church that has grown throughout the Mediterranean. Luke shares Paul's missionary concern to bring Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians together. So Luke and Acts portray the church in Jerusalem in a positive light. In fact, when you read the book of Acts, which is the follow-up to Luke, the church is very lovey-dovey. They all have one mind and they all share everything in common. It's a very rosy picture of the early church. I've already shared in these videos that one of the reasons I love these contradictions is that they show us the diversity of voices that are captured in the Bible. I mean, the fact is the people who put the Bible together included 4 different versions of this story, and they wanted to lift up different opinions, different early church ideas about not only who Jesus was, but who the church was supposed to be. The fact that we call these diverse voices inspired by God, or that we call them authoritative, means that we've already baptized or canonized a faith that values diversity and dialogue. The Bible is not a single voice. It is a chorus. It isn't a monologue. It's a dialogue. But there are 2 more reasons I like this contradiction in particular. The first is that the struggles the early church had are the struggles we still have today. Who gets to speak for the church? Is it the religious right or the religious left? Is it the acknowledged institutional leaders who have seminary educations like me, or is it the grassroots everyday Christians meeting in small groups in homes and in pubs? Are we going to be exclusive or inclusive? Do we call out hypocrites and bigots, or by doing so are we sinning in anger and becoming hypocrites ourselves? The reality is that getting involved in faith and following Jesus means getting your hands dirty. When you start to follow Jesus, you can no longer be neutral or passive about things. You're caught up in a way of life that's challenging socially, politically, economically, and religiously. Second, I think these contradictions show that Jesus was real, that he was a real person. It's become popular among some people today to claim that Jesus is completely made up, that he is a hoax. I think people who argue this have a limited understanding of critical Bible study. These folks point out that the Gospels were written decades after Jesus lived, and that Paul's letters are generally vague about the specifics of Jesus' life. But scholars have known this stuff for a long, long time. In fact, anyone who wants to study the Bible critically can see that these authors have an agenda, that they are making appeals to authorities that already exist. There's a political struggle going on between real people in Jerusalem and real people in Antioch. And the way the real people in Antioch choose to go over the heads of the real people in Jerusalem is to appeal to a real Jesus. We continue to experience the same kind of stuff today. I mean, when we began St. Junia United Methodist Church, our goal was to reach people who've been hurt or burned by church in the past. And we generally reach a younger, more progressive audience. And sometimes we get criticism that we're not reading the Bible the right way, that we're interpreting Jesus the wrong way, and appeals are made about authority and legitimacy and whether or not I am or we are real Christians. But the fact is, this is our story. This is the church's story. It's part of sacred scripture. And we have to include the ways that we argue over who gets to speak for Jesus. That's part of what it means to be a Christian, is figuring out what that means. And I would argue if you're not having that struggle, and if you're not having that discussion, if you're not talking about authority or legitimacy or who gets to speak for Jesus, then you're probably not following him. But if you are having that discussion, if you are struggling with those issues, then you're probably on the right track.